Hello and welcome to the Briefing Room. I'm your host, Bill Froehlich from WTCM Radio News. It's our weekly roundup of stories making headlines across northern Michigan. And this week I'm joined by John Flesher from the Associated Press. John, welcome back.
Thank you.
And Peter Payette from Interlochen Public Radio. Welcome back to you too, Peter. Thanks guys for coming in. This week we wanted to talk about what's going on in Lansing, what has been going on in Lansing, because it's been a busy 30 days, 45 days. There's been really quite a bit going on. And John, I know you've spent quite a bit of time down there in those 30 to 45 days. Mm-hmm. So let's kind of go chronologically here and talk about, maybe we should start with the lame duck session, because that was quite active with the right to work or freedom to work legislation, but dozens, if not hundreds, of other bills that went through as well. So John, give us your take of just the atmosphere of Lansing in those final days of 2012.
Well, it was highly charged politically, and of course it was very busy. It was just a couple of weeks post-election where the legislature that was in place had a limited amount of time to work with, and the Republican majority was sort of at its height. They lost some House seats in the election, so they knew that they were at a point with the Republican governor and control of both houses where they could. It was sort of at their maximum power to push things through, and that's what they did. And of course, the issue that grabbed most of the attention was the right to work law, which had sort of been quietly percolating for a long time, and the proposal that was on the ballot that was defeated to prevent right to work from happening, in many people's eyes, sort of gave the whole thing impetus, brought it to the forefront, and created momentum that helped push it through. There were a number of days of some behind-the-scenes, closed-door negotiations between the governor and people with labor and with business interests and Republican leadership. And quite suddenly, an announcement was made by the governor and the speaker and the Republican leader in the Senate that they had reached an agreement. And that very day, a couple of bills were pushed through the Senate. And after a required waiting period, they went through the House. And there were thousands of demonstrators who showed up, labor union representatives, their supporters. They filled the halls of the Capitol. They were chanting, they were beating drums, and it was quite the spectacle. But of course, all for naught. It happened very quickly, and the long-term repercussions of that will be uncertain for a while, as far as whether the political atmosphere has been poisoned there to an extent that it'll be hard for the governor to get Democratic support for other things he wants to do. We'll just have to see how that plays out. But it was something to witness.
What's your sense, John, of why the governor turned? He didn't want the right to work legislation. At least that's what he said. Right. Is there any clear explanation why he turned about in that? Did he get something?
The phrase that he had used repeatedly was "not on my agenda." To my knowledge, he never flatly said he opposed the concept, but he made clear that he knew it would be divisive and that it was just something that he would just as soon not deal with because it would be a distraction from some of the other things that he wanted to get done. And his argument was that it was really organized labor's fault that this happened, because they, again, by pushing the proposal 2, I believe was the proposal number, that would have outlawed right-to-work legislation, it upset a lot of people. It sort of awoke the sleeping dog, so to speak, and that it just sort of created a momentum that he couldn't stop. And when the legislative leadership and the Republican majority in both chambers made clear that they wanted to push for it. Presumably he could have dug in his heels and insisted, no, I'll veto it, but he chose not to take that course. But when he did make the decision to support it, he was quite enthusiastic about it and said that he thought that it would be a good thing, it would help to create jobs, bring new businesses to the state, improve the overall business atmosphere and be a good thing. So he became a very outspoken supporter once he reached that point.
You know, this got, as you mentioned, there were those behind-the-scenes discussions, presumably that week with labor leaders leading up to this. But even in that Friday press conference when it was all announced, the governor had said, well, this isn't anything new, or this is no big surprise. We've been talking about this for years. And the state Senate leader, I believe, said the same thing. But really that seemed disingenuous to me because, as Peter said, this was not something he had fought for. It really hadn't been a point of discussion. It just seemed a little less than forthright to say, oh, well, we've been talking about this forever.
But that would only be true of the governor. I don't think that would be true of the Republican leadership in the two chambers. I think a number of them had been outspoken for a while that they thought this ought to be a priority, and Indiana was doing it, and Michigan ought to do it.
Right. The governor said that basically in response to people who said, look, we haven't had any committee hearings about this. There hasn't been the kind of public discussion that you would need for such a drastic change in a policy. His response was, well, it's been talked about for a long time. People are familiar with the arguments back and forth, that type thing. It was an argument that did not mollify the critics at all because, well, certainly it's been discussed in kind of informal ways, but there hadn't been a specific set of legislative hearings and an opportunity to have formal on-the-record public comment, the type of thing that you normally have. That you have the committee process in the legislature, bills are introduced, they're considered and debated back and forth. Sometimes it can take months, and sometimes they don't even get through in one session and have to be reintroduced when you have really controversial material. So this was the opposite of that, and that it was a decision that they made. They knew they would take heat for it, and just decided to strike while the iron was hot and deal with the criticism.
How much of it maybe was a surprise to you or your other colleagues? You were in that press conference, I believe, weren't you?
Right.
What was the reaction just among journalists, and how much of a surprise was it? Because I listened to the MERS News, the political news group down in Lansing, had done a podcast discussion that same week where they brought up right to work, and the almost unanimous sense around that table in that podcast was right to work isn't going to happen. We're not going to see it. And then 3 days later, not only did we talk about it, but we've got the bills introduced. So it seemed like this was really a surprise to most people.
Well, rumors were flying, of course, for some time. People knew that there were discussions going on, and that there was a real interest on the part of some in the legislature to get this done. It seemed to be a little touch and go for a while as to whether it would happen or not. What the tipping point was, I can't really say, but certainly when they called the news conference, I think most people had a sense that if they were going to get together in that way, that they were probably going to announce they were going for it. But right up until the night before, there was some uncertainty. I was among some reporters who had talked with Senator Richard Bill, the majority leader, and asked where he thought things were, and he just sort of shrugged and said he really didn't know what was going to happen. So I think indeed it was uncertain for a good while, but the momentum was quietly building, and so when it happened, it was a surprise in a sense, and yet you could look back and see things pointing in that direction, and so in hindsight, it wasn't as big a surprise.
I don't know if you had any challenges, Peter, but one thing I found interesting during this week-long period, before, during, and after, it was really unusually difficult for me to get through to any of our local lawmakers. I couldn't get through to our state reps, our state senators. Voicemails, emails just kind of went unanswered. Mm-hmm. There was this black hole of communication, and I don't know if it's because nobody wanted to come out and talk about this sensitive issue, but it just kind of surprised me that I was having an unusually hard time connecting with anybody about right to work, and obviously, like you said, it's a divisive issue. I guess my last question on this topic to you, John, would be, obviously, like you said, they wanted to take advantage of their capital in the House and Senate, the Republican majority. But they also, that hasn't changed after the first of the year. The numbers have changed, but they still have the majority. Why do you think this was so important to get done in lame duck as opposed to waiting until now when they do still have the majority? It just seems to me like there could be a cost to that, either with the voters or somewhere down the line they're at risk for just how this all shook out.
I think you mentioned the key word, voters. They were at the farthest point from the next election at that time. And again, the number of they lost 5 seats, I believe, in the House. The Republicans did, so they were going to have a smaller majority to work with. I think it was just a sense that it's now or never. This is the best opportunity they're ever going to have for something like this, with control of both chambers and a Republican governor who, once he came on board, was enthusiastic and pushed for it, and so they just decided to go ahead and deal with whatever the fallout might be.
How tight was the vote?
It was almost exactly down the line, not entirely. There were a couple of Republicans who, I don't remember the exact number, who did vote against right to work, but it was a mostly party line vote.
Well, let's talk a little bit now about what else happened in lame duck, and we have nowhere near enough time to go through all of those items because there were, we've heard numbers, 200 pieces of legislation passed in those final hours. Peter, I know when I got some of those emails, and we get announcements from the governor daily almost every time there's a piece of legislation, but then there were these emails we got in December where attached are the list of 14 pieces of legislation the governor signed. Jump out to you, anything that just kind of surprised you? To me, I guess the biggest surprise was just the sheer volume of what was done.
Right. I don't know. Our coverage comes out. We don't cover those issues from here. A couple we do, but most of it comes from our bureau in Lansing. So I wasn't watching the flow too closely. We were just putting the news on that was being filed. Mm-hmm. I guess something I would have liked to have heard more about, and we reported it, but was the emergency manager bills. I wish we had looked a little closer at how legitimate the gripe was that they put a law in place that essentially did the same things that the law that voters had struck down was doing. Maybe John could fill us in on that. It did seem like everything got eclipsed by the right to work law.
Yeah, the emergency manager law was another one that is quite controversial and strikes a lot of raw nerves, especially in the Detroit area and some of the larger cities. It was another case where the governor and the leadership made a decision to risk some political backlash, because you're right, the voters had just struck down that law. And they came back with a different version of it. It offers financially troubled cities a number of options. Instead of just having an emergency manager imposed on them, they can work out some other things. If they're having if they're in dire financial straits, for example, they could work out a consent decree like as Detroit did, and they could accept some counseling of sorts, some financial counseling to help them get through. So it was different in that sense, but still it didn't really satisfy the critics. So yeah, that was one. There were, as you mentioned, there were a lot of bills going through. There were some new restrictions on abortion clinics, which was extremely controversial. The bill of interest up in the northern lands was the bill authorizing hunting of wolves, which is something that will not automatically take place. It kicks the decision to the Natural Resources Commission to decide whether there will be hunts, and if so, when the seasons will be and other conditions. Watch for that. There are going to be hearings that the commission will be having. They'll be deliberating this, but probably around May or June, a decision will be made as to whether to proceed with a hunt this fall. That will be, I think, of wide interest, even though in the Traverse City area we don't have wolves, but in the UP we do, and there's some belief that they might be making their way down into the around the tip of the mid area, and so that.
And there was, in fact, a wolf pack observed, not just a wolf, but a pack with cubs, going back a couple of years.
The other thing that just kind of occurs to me is, and this is I don't know, conspiracy theory, but just out of caution, I just wonder, was, as you alluded to, right to work maybe a distraction for the emergency financial manager law and 280 other pieces of legislation that none of us are really going to have time to pay attention to?
You're saying let's set off some fireworks, and while everyone's watching,
we'll do something else in the background. I mean, is there anything else that we don't hear about? I mean, I'm sure you know much better than I what else maybe is bubbling under the surface, because clearly none of us have time to do a story or 280 stories on every piece of legislation that has been passed.
I have a thought about that. I think this business about hearings and the fact that there were no hearings regarding the right to work law, I can see that defense. We all know what this is. It's debated policy centers, think tanks like the Mackinac Center and others put out position papers on this. But for instance, a bill that was passed in this session that potentially will have big ramifications for our region would be the changes to the Natural Resources Trust Fund Board. And I don't know the final version, but I know that what had been proposed was a change. This is the board that oversees all the state trust fund money that's spent on conservation. So a lot of pieces of property in northern Michigan that people would recognize, like Arcadia Dunes, Clay Cliffs near Leland, the shoreline purchases in Acme Township along East Grand Traverse Bay, and countless other pieces of property. I mean, the open space in Traverse City, going back, I think, to the 70s, was purchased with trust fund money. And some lawmakers believe that that board is a little too cozy with the conservation community, and they're a little too beholden to the priorities of the Department of Natural Resources and people who work at conservancies, and not accountable enough to voters. So the changes that had been proposed will alter that board to make it turn over a little more quickly and be more responsive to the legislature and the governor. And there's a good debate to be had there about what that board should look like, how it should be structured. I mean, I think there are reasonable arguments on both sides. I'd be very surprised if there was a hearing about that in December. That legislation was just swept through, and as I say, I've not looked at the final, the law that was signed, and I know some things that some people in northern Michigan were concerned about were taken out. But those are the things we ought to be having a real policy debate about, and we ought to, there ought to be some discussion back and forth about how this fund, which is a very unique fund for a state to have and has been wildly successful and is really important to the kind of pure Michigan economy of northern Michigan. Mm-hmm. And they just made changes to it, and nobody can keep track of these things. We can't, I suppose it's our responsibility as reporters to do it, but there's so many things flying, and right. It's just it's impossible. And I'd be very curious if there was any debate at all, or if basically that was just sort of packaged up in these backroom deals. This one gets to go through too in exchange for some votes on some other stuff, and boom, there you have changes to the trust fund. It's a little disconcerting.
It does kind of make you wonder what goes on in that building in the dark of night when they're just kind of, like you said, shuffling through hundreds of documents and pieces of legislation. It all just kind of comes out at once.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder, John, you've covered the Capitol for a number of years, if it's ever been any different, if there was ever some day where statesmen stood and made speeches and listened to each other and debated, or if it's always sort of backroom sausage making, and that's how we make our political decisions.
Well, presumably it's some of both. I mean, I have not covered a lot of legislative activity in Michigan in my previous life as a reporter in North Carolina, where I'm from. I was a state house correspondent there and followed the state legislature for quite a few years. And there are some things that struck me about the way things are done in Michigan. There seemed to be a lot more backroom caucusing than I was accustomed to in North Carolina, where they would debate bills sometimes for hours on end. But there was certainly a lot of deal making there too. And I do think that's, to an extent that's always been the case and always will be. I mean, the Constitution of the United States was put together behind closed doors. So there's always going to be some deal making and so forth that takes place out of public view. As journalists, our interest generally is pushing for as much to happen in the open as we can get, so that we can observe it and report it to those who read and hear our news reports. So we believe that that's in the best interest of all concerned. But there's always going to be that push and pull to between openness and sometimes the efficiency that can come with doing things out of view.
Well, let's shift gears and talk about the more recent event, the State of the State address that the governor gave recently. And John, I know you were there covering that one as well. Give me your just general overview of what was in that, what was not in that address, and just the general reaction from anyone who paid attention to that. Was there a lot of meat in it this year, so to speak?
The speech was short on detail in a number of respects. Mm-hmm. Of course, the big centerpiece of it was the governor's proposal on to fund road and bridge repairs. This is something that's been talked about for a while. Governor Granholm pushed for improvements, a big funding package for roads and bridges, and didn't get it. And it's a tough thing to push through because, of course, you're probably going to be talking about raising taxes, and people always complain about the price of gas as it is. And so politically, it's a hard thing to do. Governor Schneider has an additional problem in that the legislature, being predominantly Republican, which has been a good, helpful thing for him in the first 2 years, that can now be more problematic because Republicans generally don't like to raise taxes, and now he has to turn to them and ask for their help. He offered a framework. He called for raising taxes, the gasoline tax, but by changing the levy so that it's applied at the wholesale level instead of the 19 cents per gallon at the pump, the retail tax it's done now. If you apply it at the wholesale level, as I understand it, it could sort of rise and fall with the wholesale price of gas itself, and that would be passed on to consumers instead of just having that flat rate that it stays in place and has been in place since 1997. The argument that he made, and that the Department of Transportation makes, and that road builders, the construction industry makes, that local government people, that many people make, is that because the tax has not increased in so long, its real buying power has dropped, the road fund. And meantime, prices have risen. The price of fixing roads has risen, and the roads have deteriorated. We have up north here, the weather is tough on roads, and vehicles are. And we all know from personal experience that a lot of work needs to be done. So the governor, instead of getting to a lot of detail about what he wanted to do, really made a kind of hit hard at the basic idea that it's our responsibility to get this done. It's been delayed long enough. Everyone knows that we have this problem. Yes, there's some political risk, but we need to rise above that and get the job done. And he's going to make that, I think, his top priority and push very hard to try to get something done as soon as possible, well aware that the 2014 elections are coming.
He's also had to go to Democrats to talk about this potential to raise taxes too, which is especially interesting in light of right to work. That, I maybe ticked you off a month ago, but hey, now here I need you to help me raise taxes, which is equally unpopular in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and it's going to be extremely interesting to watch that dynamic, frankly. The Democrats in the immediate aftermath of the speech were not being very encouraging. They were saying that the governor is continuing to push for putting more burden on the middle class and working class, and not asking the wealthy and the corporations to pay their fair share. So that was their initial response. One would think that a willingness to raise taxes for infrastructure would be something that they would in principle support, and they may very well at some point. I suspect that the governor is going to have to work pretty hard to win over their support, particularly if a few members of his own party are willing to help him out. But that will be the story that will play out over the coming months, and it will be very interesting to watch.
What do you think he could actually do to appease Democrats? I mean, realistically speaking, given the GOP control of the legislature.
You're not going to see them overturn right to work. I imagine that certainly they would, the Democrats would like to see more funding for education, for example. They have not been at all happy with the governor's take on education issues. There's concern about legislation that could increase what Democrats believe is voucherization or more privatizing of schools. I'm sure, will be trying to put the brakes on some of that. So there are many things I'm sure that they would like to see the governor support, and I'm sure that there will be some discussions and perhaps some deal making going on if indeed a road package comes up that they're willing to support. I don't know specifically what they would push for, but there are plenty of things they could choose from.
Yeah. The one idea I did hear yesterday was to raise the gas tax now, but then to give voters the option in November to remove that gas tax and replace it with an increase in the state sales tax, which kind of forces the voters' hand in deciding whether they want this gas tax, which may already get passed, in exchange for, a sales tax or vice versa. So, like you said, there's a lot of, I don't know, decision making or
right, yeah.
ideas brewing of just how to pull this off, and it sounds like maybe it'll come one way or the other, and we just have to decide how we want to pay for it.
Right. One of the options has been talked about is raising the sales tax and even possibly doing away with the gas tax. Just raising the sales tax on all goods and using the amount of money that you would raise from the increase itself, not the whole tax, but from the increase, and applying that to roads and bridges apparently would be a pretty good sum of money. So there are a lot of ideas that are I think, percolating out there, and I think the governor was intentionally wanted to avoid prescribing too much in the way of detail in his speech to leave plenty of room for negotiation as we go forward.
I think Senator Howard Walker from Traverse City was one of those who first mentioned at least some variation of that idea of the sales tax increase. He's also, I believe, chairman of the K-12 education funding committee for this year as well. So locally, he may kind of have a say in a lot of that debate back and forth. Isn't that possible?
Yes, I would imagine so.
Anything else that jumps out from state of the state to either of you gentlemen that we want to talk about here in the closing minutes?
Well, one thing that I was interested in was the governor's mention of harbors in his transportation pitch, and mainly that debate is about roads, but as people that boat will know, the harbors on the Great Lakes are getting difficult to access, even going back to 2007 when there was a lot of attention on the harbor at Onekama, where a large yacht that was returning from the Mackinac race tried to make land and get in out of a storm and got stuck, and because there wasn't enough water depth, and the waves basically crushed it into nobody was hurt, but the boat was destroyed. And since then, there's been a lot of attention on the fact that the federal government is not paying to dredge all these harbors of refuge, that it collects a fee they collect a fee on the shippers pay some kind of freight fee in order to have a fund of money to dredge these harbors, and the federal government has not been doing it. So now towns like Leland have had to go and raise the money locally to keep the harbor open, and now the water levels are coming down to a point that is the lowest on record. And so the governor mentioned harbors, and there's some talk of whether the state might take on this responsibility, because everybody's been waiting for the federal government to get that fund in action. That money's just been sort of passed into the general budget of the federal government, not used for harbors. And so now the governor is considering, I guess, I'm not sure to what extent, whether the state needs to make that happen and keep those harbors open. And there was that quick reference to it. But it's something that the state might not want to do, because once they do it once, then it may become a state responsibility and expectation. And I think the Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, would like to have the expectation taken off of their plate, but they're still collecting that money to pay for it, just not using it for the purpose for which it was collected.
Well, they're doing some dredging, but it's of the large commercial harbors.
They do.
Their argument is that it's the big shippers who pay for this, and so they should certainly get top priority when it comes to dredging. But you're right, it leaves a lot of the smaller harbors out in the cold, and they're having some real problems. In some cases, you have long stretches along the lakes where there is no harbor of refuge, and if you come to one that, if you're in trouble and you come to one where you can't get in, then it's potentially very dangerous. And in the case of Onekama, that's one example of a little tourist village that really depends on boats being able to get in and out of their inner lake and out into the big lake. And if they're shut off, it really is a horrible economic hit for the community. So they're not alone in that predicament. So it is really, as the water levels continue to drop, a huge issue for this whole region.
It seems like with the lowest water levels we've seen in almost in history, that it's especially important, but maybe it's especially convenient time to do it. I don't know, maybe it makes it easier to do the dredging with the water level so low. We are out of time this week here on the Briefing Room. I want to thank John Flesher from Associated Press and Peter Payette from Interlochen Public Radio. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you'll join us again next week. I'm Bill Froehlich. Thanks for watching.